Hi, everyone. Welcome. I hope you're having a good weekend. My name is Durgadas Alon Doriel. I'm the author of the little work, Magic to Transform Your Everyday Life from Llewellyn Books. And I'm here to talk to you today about setting healthy spiritual standards for ourselves. So I know that this is a topic that can evoke a strong emotional reaction from a lot of people, many different types of reactions. There are Virgos in the room, there are Pisces in the room, there are all different kinds of people, all different kinds of astrological configurations, right? So the reason why I wanted to talk about this, because where I come from, my background is that I'm somebody who, when I was growing up, was not into standards, not into rules, not into discipline, not into any of that. And then I had an experience in my early 20s where I joined a Hermetic order, and I had a structured, disciplined approach to spiritual development for the first time. And it dramatically transformed my life. It transformed my life in ways that I didn't know were possible. It helped me heal in ways that I don't know that I really believed that I could. And so I've become a cheerleader of this topic. I focus on it a lot in my book. So if you enjoy this presentation, I encourage you to check out my book. And that's what we're going to focus on today, setting healthy spiritual standards for ourselves. So first of all, in order to go over this topic, we have to explore what standards are, what healthy standards are, what spiritual standards are, and then what healthy spiritual standards are. And then we're going to look at how to make some of those. And that's what we're going to do for about 20 minutes. And then there's going to be a question and answer. So first of all, what are standards? So there are two main types of standards that I know about and that we're going to look at today. The first type of standards is an agreed upon way of how to do something to produce a desired outcome. So that would be like a manufacturing standard, right? When we're building an airplane, we are making sure that the screws are made of a certain material and that the parts are configured in a certain way because we want to make sure that plane is safe, right? So the desired outcome is a safe plane. And then the standard is how we do that based on our knowledge and expertise. So that's one type of standard. We also see that type of standard in education. Right? If I'm studying to be an engineer, what do I need to know to be competent in that field so that I can then offer those skills to my employer with whatever I'm tasked with engineering? The next type of standard is minimum requirements. And this is something that we see like in relationships, right? I'm sure most of us are familiar with the concept of having high standards or low standards in relationships and what a difference that can make. And those standards are what we're willing to accept for ourselves in a relationship, our minimum requirements. And minimum requirements is a good segue into what is a healthy standard. Because as I'm sure most of us know, maybe from personal experience, right? Low standards can be unhealthy and high standards can be unhealthy, or high standards can be healthy depending on what the standards are. So a healthy standard, as I define it, is a standard that supports our well-being overall. So when we're talking about relationships as an example of a relationship standard that would be too low, that would not be healthy. And I don't think anybody would ever say this out loud maybe, but they might be living in accord with it, would be something like, I don't require that my partners treat me respectfully, right? I will accept poor treatment in a relationship just because I don't want to be alone. Right? That would be an unhealthy standard. Now, the converse of that, the astronomical standards that I'm sure many of us are familiar with in relationships are things like, he's got to be perfect, right? He's got to have the best job. He's got to be so nice to me. He's got to know everything that I'm thinking about intimately because he's interested in all the same topics and we're just going to be so perfect for each other, right? And then nobody can meet these astronomical standards and we end up alone, or in a never-ending cycle of doomed relationships. So those are two examples of unhealthy standards. Now, a healthy standard, if we're talking about relationships, could be something like, I deserve to be treated with respect by my partner. And that's what I'm going to receive. And if I'm not receiving that, maybe I'll have like a 3 strikes rule or something with someone I'm dating. But overall, in general, I need to be treated respectfully, and that's a minimum requirement. And if I'm not, I'm out. So that's a healthy standard. So when we flip over and we're talking about spirituality, a spiritual standard would be something that affects how we're practicing in terms of how we want to practice, what we want to do, because we have some kind of desired outcome. And what that outcome is will affect what the standards are. And each of us can have our own outcomes and different outcomes. And that's actually something that I'm probably going to talk about more, but that I really, really, really want to emphasize, which is that your standards spiritually are based on your own intentions, where you're coming from. And where you're coming from can radically change what the standards are, right? If I just want to be a little more spiritually connected every day, the standards I'm going to set for myself are very different from somebody who's moving into a devotional spiritual community with the goal of achieving spiritual enlightenment, and that's their main number one priority. Right? And I'm not putting a value judgment on either of those paths. I'm just acknowledging that what is a healthy standard depends on what it is we're even intending. So some examples of a spiritual standard could be something like, I'm going to practice every day. I would say that's the most common one, is having some form of daily practice. Another example could be, when I'm in my daily practice, my phone is off. Right? Unless I'm a parent of a small child or a caretaker, or I have some reason to keep the phone on, but the phone's off or I'm not checking it. Another type of a standard could be, all right, let's say I do 20 minutes of ritual every morning. Not only am I doing this 20 minutes of ritual, but how am I showing up? Who am I in that moment as I'm doing these 20 minutes of ritual? Am I bringing my all to it, or am I just phoning it in? So they're like rules or guidelines that we set for ourselves to help us realize the intentions that we have spiritually, to help us develop and grow in that way. And that's, this term, standards, rules, discipline, structure, it can bring up, like I said earlier, a lot of negative reactions for people, because when these things are imposed by authority figures, especially if we don't agree with the standards or why they're being imposed, then that can be very oppressive and feel horrible and stifling, and not what most of us are looking for when we turn to spirituality. So we want to take care when creating spiritual standards for ourselves to make sure that they're healthy, to make sure that they're supporting our well-being overall. And the reason why I say overall is because if we are on a path of personal transformation and healing and growth and spiritual development, and I believe spiritual development contains all of those things, then that means inevitably we have to push ourselves outside of our comfort zone, right? We can't just orbit in our status quo. So when we push ourselves outside of our comfort zone, that is uncomfortable by definition. That brings some stress. And in some moments, depending on what we need to look at to push ourselves, we might feel very uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean that's not healthy, right? And that doesn't mean that doesn't support our well-being overall. So that's why I add overall in the healthy spiritual standards. So the next piece that I wanted to talk about this in terms of what is a healthy standard, I also want to acknowledge that a lot of us, especially those of us in America, are coming from a culture overall, like the overculture, that has a toxic relationship to productivity, right? That says, if you're not constantly doing, if you're not constantly achieving, if you're not constantly building, then there is something wrong with you. You are not being what you're supposed to be, right? Be all that you can be turned into a tool, a weapon of shame, right? A weapon of guilt, rather than a more authentic process of honoring ourselves, something that integrates self-care, something that recognizes natural human limitations and needs, and that we're not just here to be robots who produce, and then die, right? But that's a message that so many of us get. And so I want to be very clear that when I'm talking about healthy spiritual standards, I am not talking about that. And I'm also not talking about the trip, falling into the trip of all of that. So that's something that's really important to watch out for as we set healthy spiritual standards for ourselves. And I'll talk about this more when we're at that point, that we are watching out for. I'm making sure I'm doing my best to check in with myself regularly to know I'm not falling into that narrative. I'm not falling into that narrative of I don't have value as a person. I'm less valuable because I didn't meditate today as well as I aspire to, right? Okay, so that's one thing. And I also wanted to say that there are a lot of people who just want their spiritual path to be totally spontaneous. And if that's you, that's awesome. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. But that is different from somebody who has a little bit more of a clear-cut aspiration, or just wants to deepen their relationship to spirit in a more intentional way. So another thing about just the toxic productivity culture is that, again, perfectionism can be so toxic when we have a lack of compassion for ourselves and we root it in our self-esteem. So this isn't supposed to be punitive. This is supposed to be additive. And why would we set spiritual standards for ourselves, and what makes it additive? Because spiritual development is a real thing, and our efforts toward it make a difference. Like I said at the beginning, I had no idea how my life would change when I embraced a disciplined spiritual practice. And good grief, if someone had told me earlier what it would do, I would have done it sooner. I would have, I think, hopefully. But anyway, it makes a difference. It makes a huge difference. There are things that we can experience that we don't know about. Maybe we've read about them. Maybe we've had glimpses of them. But there's a reason why there are so many exercises in all of these Llewellyn books, right? It's because they lead to something. And consistent practice is what tends to yield results. And inconsistent practice, half-hearted practice, low standards, right, doesn't. And that's just the truth. For most people, that is true. Every once in a while, you get someone who's extremely gifted in some way spiritually, maybe who has just like a natural tendency to astrally project. Maybe they have like Pisces moon conjunct Neptune in the 12th house. Sorry for the momentary astro jargon. But my point is, most of us have to work if we want to have an experience like that. And astral projection is actually a really good topic to weave in here, because that is something where if that's what you want to do, you want to have an out-of-body experience consciously and be able to do that at will. Well, there are action steps that can contribute to you being able to do that. Relaxation exercises, energy visualization processes, energy engagement processes, and doing that every day is usually what people in that field recommend if you want to develop that skill. So the first reason spiritual development is a real thing. It makes a difference. I have never known anyone who committed to spiritual practice, who really committed, who has not benefited from it, who has not actually usually become someone on a soapbox about it. It makes a huge, huge, huge difference. And we see this in so many areas, right? If we want to develop a skill, if I want to be a better artist, I have to practice art. My day job is as a psychotherapist, and I do therapy skills with people, cognitive behavioral therapy skills that are actually very similar to a lot of spiritual work, spiritual self-inquiry. And I often say that that's like physical therapy for the mind. If we want to develop and grow in that way, then the way to do it is consistent practice. And that's a standard, right? That's one type of standard. So standards matter when we have a desired outcome that could benefit from or is dependent upon adopting and following the standard. And that holds for both definitions. The other thing is when we declare the standard, we have something to strive for, and we have something that contains us. It's a boundary. Right? If I say I'm going to practice daily, then I've drawn a line in the sand. Then now I have something to hold me in when the waters get rocky. Because the other thing too is the more we honor our standards, the stronger they become. They become habits that we can maintain. Now, another reason to adopt standards, and I would say this is maybe even probably the biggest reason, is that we have a natural human resistance to change. When it features the unknown, when it's outside of our status quo, there is a part of us that in many spiritual traditions is called the ego that doesn't want to stretch. And the amazing thing about this, one of the amazing things about this is even if we are in an unhealthy circumstance that we know is unhealthy, the ego still wants to stay. It still wants to stay. So we have a part of us that wants to keep us back. So in order to move forward, sometimes we have to push. And a standard is a push. It is holding a line in a certain place, containment, holding space for change and growth so that we'll actually get there. And the thing about ego resistance, and I actually talk about this a lot in my book, is that it's often very subtle. It's often very subtle. And the most common example of ego resistance that I know of is comes up from New Year's resolutions. And we can have the healthiest resolutions. Oh, I'm going to go to the gym 5 days a week. That sounds great. But then somehow 2 weeks in, all of a sudden I have no motivation. Interesting. Interesting how I know objectively that this is so good for me. This is so important. And yet now I just can't find any motivation to do it out of nowhere. So that's an example. Another example in a spiritual setting would be you're meditating and all of a sudden you just feel like a fly is crawling all over you and you want to swat it, but you can't if you want to maintain the practice. So ego resistance can be very subtle, but the point is that it's there. When we go to change, something resists. And when we make standards, when we make guidelines for our spiritual development process, that helps us hold to our forward momentum when we feel that resistance. Because again, that resistance can be very, very subtle. Healing comes from consistency. In my experience, like I was talking about with psychotherapy, it really makes a huge difference to make a commitment to ourselves and our work. And the other thing I wanted to say too, and I'm going to talk about this as I transition into how to set spiritual standards for ourselves, is for me, in the order that I was in, we started with 5 minutes a day. 5 minutes a day. That's it. One ritual, 5 minutes a day. And it was amazing to me how that made such a huge difference. And what I'll say about that is the good thing about 5 minutes, and this is why I'm a huge proponent of start small, is that it wasn't just that I did that ritual. It was that 5 minutes was a short enough time that I could bring my all to it, right? Another type of standard. It's not just what we're doing, it's how we're doing it. And it makes a difference in the outcomes that we get most of the time. Spirituality really is, in my opinion, it is like a flowering, right? So we don't have total control over the spiritual experiences we have or how we develop and evolve. We don't. But I think that much like a flowering, we do have this sort of sacred plant of our spiritual life inside of us. And we can't control when it blooms, but we can make sure that it's nourished, that it's cared for, that the area around it is weeded, that it's planted in a place where it gets direct sun, right? We can do all of those things. And then when we get those things, the plant is healthier. The plant is healthier, whether it's flowered yet or not. And it's more likely to flower and flower sustainably when that moment comes. And so that's really a lot of the value of setting spiritual standards, is taking care of what we have so that we can develop that way, so that we are ready with our jar open when the lightning of spirit strikes to bottle it. That is something we can control. And that is part of the value of spiritual discipline and why we see it all over the world in so many spiritual traditions, Okay, so in terms of how to actually create a spiritual standard, step one for me would be to ask yourself what you want. Again, this is about you. This is about what you want for yourself in your spiritual path. Where do you want to be? You can be specific. I want to astrally project, if that's a goal of yours, if it lends itself to that specificity. Or if it's more abstract, like I just want to feel more spiritually connected every day, then you make it more specific. And we make it more specific by focusing on, okay, what does that actually mean? What does it actually mean to be more spiritually connected every day? And what leads you to feel spiritually connected now? What do you think might help you achieve that? Well, when I do ritual, I feel spiritually connected. Okay, so I'm going to do a ritual several times a week. When I read a spiritual book in a meditative state, I feel spiritually connected. Okay, so then I'm going to make space to do that, right? So we have the intention, and then we backwards map. I want to be more spiritually present in my relationships. I want to have a spiritual connection with my partner. Okay, so what does that mean? What does that mean? And what might actually help get me there? So that's an example of how to build a spiritual standard. And one thing I would say about them is when we build them, it's important to set up areas for evaluation and accountability. So for example, daily practice, what I was taught in my Hermetic order, and the funny thing is I would not have resonated with this at all when I was younger and not interested in rules or structure. But they gave us checklists to make sure we did our practices. And I've benefited so much from that, but that's just a basic level of accountability, making sure you've actually done it. Because the thing is, talking about the ego, when I don't hold the line, I've definitely seen, oh, wow, that was so important. And I haven't thought about it in 4 months. I'm sure many of you have had that experience. You had a goal that seemed so important to you, took your eye off the ball, and then it was gone for months at a time. So some form of accountability is important. And evaluation is important too, to be able to say, is this working? Does this feel punitive? Have I turned this into that's my cat. Have I turned this into like a toxic productivity situation? And how do I need to course correct? Because this is really about you. And that's the point. At the end of the day, this is about you and what you want for yourself, how you want to develop spiritually, where you want to go, and to just recognize that there are places to go. There are experiences that we can have. There is healing that we can receive. There is transformation that we can realize. These are not unreal things that we just hope exist. They're actual things we can experience in our lives, and standards are one way of getting there. So thank you all for listening today and coming and showing up on a Sunday. And now we're going to open to some questions. So for people who are not on the Crowdcast, I'm looking into the column. Maybe nobody has a question. If anybody has a question, feel free to ask it now. Yes. I just want to acknowledge that somebody said, Ren said, having guidelines like that seems like it would be good for neurodivergent people in particular. Yes, as someone who has an anxiety disorder and a depressive disorder, it has been extraordinarily helpful for me. I talk about that more in my book. Okay, this question is from Mickey. Do you think that having challenging standards in other areas in life, like relationships, can carry over into our spiritual standards? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's definitely a continuum. Look, in my opinion, and my book is a lot about this, it's all one big process. There really isn't functionally a division between our spiritual life and other aspects of our life as we continue to grow and open spiritually. And absolutely, I think there's this wonderful quote, how you do anything is how you do everything. And my first teacher used to say that all the time. And I really have benefited from that and see that. Yes, do you have any advice for starting a type of monastic practice at home? I do, and this is going to be one of those shameless plug moments because I talk about that extensively in my book. I give specific examples for how to develop a daily practice, both ritual and meditation. But the basic thing I would say is look at the home as a monastery and backwards map from there. Well, what does that mean? What would that look like? And, what does a monastery do, right? There's going to be certain times of the day where they're praying, where they're meditating, where they're studying. And how can you incorporate that into your home life, maybe with a schedule? And that question was from, oh, hold on, that was from Christopher. So Dina asked a question about restarting exercise after injury. I'm not really sure what to do in terms of physical health. In terms of that, I would defer to whoever your medical practitioner is. Gwen asked the title of my book, The Little Work, Magic to Transform Your Everyday Life. What easy morning routines can you recommend? From Alora, I would say something as simple as lighting a candle and saying a blessing, some kind of devotional moment, some kind of getting centered, right? Taking a moment to just connect and feel spirit, feel presence, and then affirming that in some way, whatever that means to you, whatever that looks like to you. How do you stop being hard on yourself if you veer off course? I would say, first of all, easier said than done. Second of all, putting compassion at the center of the practice. There's a quote from the Tao Te Ching, compassionate toward yourself, you reconcile all beings in the world. That was like stunned me when I first read it in my early 20s, and it's become the heart of my practice. And that's really what I would say is that step one is acknowledging that compassion for self and other is so much of what spiritual development is ultimately about. And when we put that at the start of our practice and make a habit of actively being compassionate for ourselves, it's helpful when we veer off course. The thing is with that too, though, is we don't want to be so compassionate that it turns into the ego distracting us from ever doing anything. But yeah, compassion is huge, so important. Do you suggest any particular ways to follow up on yourself and keeping your goals and standards in line? Yes, I have a spreadsheet. I have a spreadsheet that tracks my practices. I have a spreadsheet that tracks my goals. This is something I got from the order that I was in, and I make sure that I look at it regularly. There's just nothing like having those objective forms of measure to refer back to see if we did something or not, and making time to do it. What one thing did you learn while in your Hermetic order that made the biggest change for you? That I did not have to be beholden to the stories in my mind that I had grown up with about who I was and how the world is. That I could be free from the narratives that told me that I was less than, for being gay, for being lots of things, for being emotional, that I could recreate my experience of day-to-day life in alignment with my own values that I determined for myself, and that I could heal from the pain of those experiences in large part. That was the thing I got out of it the most, and after. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions. Can the ritual-led life become obsessive? Absolutely, you have to be careful. Again, that's what I would say about compassion. Do you have any good resources for learning more about ego death? So ego death isn't a term that I often use, but I would say anybody who wants to study the ego in the spiritual context, really important to read things like the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. You could also look at the Vedas themselves. You could read the Dhammapada, the teachings of the Buddha. How can we connect with you further? This is from Jennifer. I am on Instagram and Facebook. I'm on Twitter too. The platform I'm the most active on is Instagram, but I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Any suggestions for anxiety? From Tommy. Yes. So this is something that I also cover extensively in my book, but, and I'm not saying this now as a therapist, I'm just saying this. And so this is not, I'm not giving clinical advice in this moment. But what has really helped me with anxiety is mindfulness meditation, daily relaxation exercises, and the cognitive processes on acknowledging when something is a symptom of an anxiety disorder, challenging the anxious thoughts that I have in the moment, and also affirming things to myself like I have effective coping skills, because anxiety tells us that we don't. Right? That's one of the main things anxiety says, fight, flight, or freeze. Oh, you can't handle that. You can't deal with that. And usually we have more effective coping skills than we think we do, but I talk about that actually specifically in the book. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. I hope you enjoyed this. And yeah, I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Take care.